Well, thanks everybody for coming. Thank you, especially our board members who came tonight to the Tower Center. Bob Jordan, Ambassador Jordan, welcome. Linda Gibbons, Penny Cook, I saw you. Linda McFarland, Tom Dunning, and of course Jean Fox. Thank you all for coming here. Thank you students for coming, especially those brave hearty souls for standing in the back. Well done. I'll remember this when grading time comes around. The rest of you,
you don't ask why.
The rest of you students who are lazily sitting there, I will remember that as well. As my colleague Jim Hollingfield said, our timing is excellent. Can't think of a better time to just have an event on grand strategy, given the events of the last couple of weeks, and especially the debate that has gone on for the last couple of days. This is an extraordinary time where everybody is debating U.S. strategy, or potential U.S. strategy against ISIS. The current debates about Iraq and Syria and Ukraine are all about strategy, the use of force or the potential use of force to achieve some political objective. And these are really important questions and really important debates. And I think there's a reason so many people are here tonight is to hear about them. But these debates about strategy are nested in what I think is a far more important question, and that's about grand strategy. Grand strategy, the basic approach that the nation takes to secure itself, the underlying principles which guide how it makes itself safe in the world. So we can ask questions about how best to take on ISIS or how best to confront Vladimir Putin. But the more important and deeper question is, what is our theory of security? How are we going to keep ourselves safe? And I can think of no two better people to address that question than the gentleman sitting here with me tonight. On my right is Barry Posen, Ford Professor of Political Science and Director of the Security Studies at MIT, one of the most astute and trenchant critics of American grand strategy working today, the author of a very important book that just came out called Restraint, available now from Cornell University Press, Restraint, a New Foundation for U.S. Grand Strategy. But I should say Barry Posen has been writing about grand strategy for a lot longer than just this year. In fact, he's written one of the seminal pieces on the topic going back 30 years now. So he's a real expert on it. And on his right is Hal Brands, professor at Duke University in the Sanford School of Public Policy. Hal has written 3 books, including From Berlin to Baghdad, America's Search for Purpose in the Post-Cold War World. And this recent book, which also came out this year, called What Good is Grand Strategy? Power and Purpose in American Statecraft, from Harry S. Truman to George W. Bush. These are both terrific books. They're both very important, and they've gotten quite a lot of attention. So I'll stop talking and let them talk. What we're going to do is we're going to have about 20 to 25 minutes a piece, and then we will open it up to Q&A, because I'm sure there are going to be many questions. We'll start with Hal Brands.
All right. Well, thank you very much for the introduction, Josh. Thanks to the Tower Center for having me, and thanks to all of you for being here tonight. I'll just briefly say it's a great pleasure to be here with Professor Posen, who has done more than anyone in terms of writing about, thinking about grand strategy. It's also very nice to be back at SMU. I actually have some roots stretching back to the time when I was very young here, so it's nice to be back on campus. So, to get right down to business, I'm sure that foreign policy is on a lot of people's minds tonight, given the anniversary of 9/11 and given the President's speech last night. As prior warning, I'm not going to focus on ISIS or Iraq or Syria specifically in my talk tonight, although I'm sure we will get into these things later. I'm going to try to pull back a little bit and ask a broader question. So what has America's larger global strategy, its grand strategy, been during the Obama years? And what are the strengths and weaknesses of that strategy? So this is obviously a pretty key issue in terms of thinking about U.S. foreign policy in the post-9/11 and now the post-George W. Bush era. I would say the post-Iraq era, but it's not so post anymore. And I think it's an issue where there's actually been quite a lot of confusion. So if you recall the President's speech at West Point at the end of this past May, it was a speech that was really roundly booed by the punditocracy. And it unleashed this torrent of criticism to the effect that the United States lacked a grand strategy, that it had become rudderless in foreign affairs under Obama. And if anything, those critiques have only gotten louder after the events of the summer. Tonight, I'm going to make a somewhat different argument. I think the Obama administration has had a grand strategy in the sense that there have been overarching strategic principles guiding U.S. policy under Obama. I also think that those principles are at least fairly plausible and defensible in sort of a big picture sense of what the United States ought to be trying to achieve in the world. That's the good news. The bad news is that this strategy also has some pretty serious dilemmas, problems, and limitations embedded within it. And that some of those issues are really coming to the surface even right now. Okay, so before talking about Obama's grand strategy specifically, let me just say a couple words about what a grand strategy is in general. In my mind, a grand strategy is an integrated set of principles and priorities that really give structure to a country's statecraft. It consists of a series of judgments about the nature of the global environment, a country's highest goals and interests within that environment, the primary threats to those goals and interests, and then the way that limited resources can be used to deal with various challenges and opportunities. And if you have a grand strategy, you're not just sort of making these judgments in a vacuum. They're actually driving your day-to-day policies, how you deploy military resources, how you allocate foreign aid, and so on and so forth. And so at its best, a grand strategy is the connective tissue that links a country's biggest objectives to its everyday dealings with the world. It's the theory or the logic that helps nations navigate a complex international environment. It's not a panacea. It's not a roadmap with all the twists and turns plotted out in advance, because the world is just too complicated for that. A grand strategy is really just a set of generally coherent ideas about what we want to achieve in the world and how we want to get there. And they need to be firm enough to keep our policies oriented amid all the stuff that's happening in the world. They also need to be flexible enough to allow for adaptation and even improvisation in terms of implementation. So that's my take on grand strategy. What has U.S. grand strategy under Obama been? I'd say that for several years now, this administration has pursued a grand strategy that really consists of three big ideas, each of which is framed by one of the geopolitical contexts in which the United States is operating. The first of these contexts is the post-Cold War context. So by virtually any standard, the post-Cold War world has been extremely favorable to the United States. It's an order that's been very stable and peaceful when it comes to great power relations, at least by any meaningful historical comparison. It's an order in which the democracies, particularly the U.S., have enjoyed a clear preponderance of power. It's an order that, in the aggregate, has been pretty favorable to the advance of free markets and democracy. It's basically an order in which the United States can live very comfortably and very advantageously. And so the first principle of the Obama grand strategy has been to preserve that order by sustaining the American leadership and primacy on which it's based. This isn't a goal that's original for this administration. It dates back to the 1990s, certainly. But it's one that this administration has picked up, and it's one that you can see if you read carefully in basically any Obama administration strategy document. And this principle it's evident in policies that are so long-standing and so ingrained that we often forget how significant they really are. Maintaining the world's strongest military as the backbone of the international order, reaffirming our alliance commitments and forward force deployments as a source of stability, opposing proliferation by countries like Iran and other nasty things that we fear could disrupt the existing order, seeking to deepen the international economy through free trade agreements, and so on. At their deepest root, all of these policies reflect a commitment to preserving and even extending a favorable international order. And I think that's the first big principle of Obama grand strategy. The second principle is more original, or at least newer, and it flows from a different context, and that's the post-Iraq context. By that, I simply mean the perception, and a correct one in my view, that the U.S. was overstretched due to its post-9/11 wars. That extended military conflict in Iraq, in particular, had weakened U.S. power rather than strengthened it, and that after Iraq, U.S. military spending was almost inevitably going to decline. And so this context shaped the second principle of Obama's strategy, which was that, yes, we needed to sustain American primacy and influence, but we needed smarter, cheaper, and more prudent ways of exerting that influence, particularly when force was involved. We needed to avoid prolonged stability or counterinsurgency operations that we couldn't afford. We needed to find more discreet ways of applying force. We needed to get others to bear more of the burden when the use of force was involved. And as we've all no doubt heard, the President's advisors boiled them down into what was probably too pithy a bumper sticker. Don't do stupid stuff. Right? Don't do something that would become another Iraq and consume U.S. energies for another decade. And the policy applications of this idea are pretty easy to see. So think about the reliance on drone strikes as a primary and comparatively low-cost tool for counterterrorism. Think about leading from behind and the very light footprint in Libya. Think about the administration's deep reluctance for more than 3 years to get involved militarily in Syria, although that's obviously changing now. I'll come back to that later. All of these things have flowed from this second principle. So yes to American leadership, but yes to the grand strategy. And this third principle is framed against a third context, which is what you might call the dawning of the Asian century. And this, of course, refers to the belief that the Asia-Pacific is going to be the cockpit of 21st century geopolitics and economic dynamism, and that the rise of China in particular presents the greatest long-term challenge for U.S. strategy, not just in East Asia, but probably globally as well. And so the corresponding strategic principle was and is that we needed to reorient our geographical focus to keep pace with the times. Most particularly, it meant that we needed to extract ourselves from such deep military entanglements in the Middle East, the region that has consumed so much of our attention over the past decade, and refocus our resources and our attention on the long game. And this was especially true, the thinking went, because our resources were going to be more stretched going forward, and so prioritization becomes more important. This was obviously the rationale for the originally much touted and now much derided Asia pivot, as the logic behind policies like the opening to Myanmar, plans to station Marines in Darwin, pursuing the Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Pact, and others. It was also a strong reason, I think, why the White House was so eager to wind down American involvement in Iraq in 2010 and 2011, and why it's clearly determined to bring down the curtain on U.S. military involvement in Afghanistan as well. And if you think that the Asia-Pacific is the future, then bogging yourself down in the Middle East or Southwest Asia means getting stuck in the past. And so that's been the third essential line of U.S. grand strategy under Obama. Now, I want to be clear, when I call these principles a grand strategy, I'm not saying they explain everything that the administration has done, or that these ideas were flawlessly correct or cohesive. What I'm saying is that these basic principles have anchored the administration's thinking about big picture global issues, that there are pretty obviously dominant themes in major strategy documents and speeches, that they relate to one another in fairly coherent ways, and that we can see their influence across a broad range of actual policies. To me, that's a grand strategy, or at least it indicates that there have been grand strategic concepts guiding American policy. So then the question is it a good grand strategy? Well, at the 30,000-foot level, you could make the case that this has actually been a reasonable set of goals for the United States to pursue. And that I think that none of the core principles that make up the Obama administration grand strategy are obviously wrong in a fundamental way. I think it's true that the post-Cold War order has been enormously favorable to the United States, and that we should want to maintain that order well into the future. I think it's correct to judge that the rise of China as a potential peer challenger is the most significant strategic problem, the biggest threat to that unipolar order over the long term. And so if we're playing the long game, which is what grand strategy is about, then our geographical priorities have to reflect it. Finally, I would say that this grand strategy was broadly correct in judging that there was a degree of overstretch in 2008-2009, that avoiding big mistakes is a worthwhile objective in its own right, and that you have to make the costs of American engagement bearable, economically, militarily, politically bearable, if you want to sustain that engagement over the long run. And indeed, I would say that given the resource limitations that we're starting to face over the past few years, this emphasis on prudence seems fairly compelling. So that's the upside. We've had overarching grand strategic principles over the last few years. Those principles aren't all that wildly off base when it comes to what the U.S. should be trying to achieve in the world. And I think you can point to some policies where these principles have led to good enough results, although I'm not going to talk about that last part in detail for reasons of time. But there's also a downside. Grand strategies can simultaneously sound reasonable in their goals, but be very problematic in their particulars. And I think that's the case here, because if you zoom in a little bit, it's become clear that this grand strategy has always had some real problems and dilemmas lurking not far from the surface. Some of these issues reflect the way the strategy is implemented. Some of them are just inherent to the strategy itself, and some have to do with factors that policymakers don't have a lot of control over. What all of these things have in common is that they are now coming pretty starkly into view. I think they're raising some fairly serious questions about how viable and successful this strategy will be going forward. And in fact, they may even be causing the Obama administration to rethink some of its core strategic convictions, at least in a partial sense, particularly in the Middle East. I'm not going to discuss discuss all these issues for reasons of time, but I will just point out 5 that I think are particularly important. Okay, so the first problem, which I think became apparent in the reaction to the President's West Point speech, was that this strategy just doesn't have any rhetorical room. Preserving the status quo and avoiding big mistakes are fine to have as goals, but there's nothing stirring about them. Don't do stupid stuff isn't an inspiring rally. And this may seem like a meaningless quibble or a cheap shot, but I don't think it is. Grand strategies need domestic support. Domestic support is easier to get when we can describe our strategy in terms that are intuitively appealing to Americans who don't spend a lot of time thinking about foreign affairs. So maybe maybe the answer is better rhetoric, but I don't think that's the case. I think the problem is inherent to the grand strategy, and this is something, by the way, that Josh has written about very nicely. Strategies that can be justified in terms of achieving some inspiring goal or defeating some massive overriding danger, they tend to package better than those that can't. Not just the world's strongest military, but one that is dramatically stronger than its rivals. One that's so strong that it can shape events and preserve stability, not just in our neighborhood, but in regions around the world. And so it's hard not to wonder about this aspect of U.S. strategy, whether it will continue to be feasible if the defense budget continues on a downward trajectory, especially if subsequent rounds of the sequester continue. Even the existing budget cuts are forcing shifts in the defense strategy that was outlined as recently as 2012. And they've really raised some questions about whether there's any military substance to the Asia pivot. When you add in the major Chinese military buildup that's been going on for a couple decades, you start to get a not too pretty picture of what the East Asian military balance might look like 10 or 30 years hence. If the U.S. cuts go deeper and Chinese spending continues on its current trajectory, this problem is only going to get worse. Now, just to clarify, I'm not saying that we're in any immediate danger of not having the world's strongest military. What I am saying is that over a longer period, we may be losing a margin of dominance, particularly in a place like East Asia, that makes our grand strategy viable. Okay. A third dilemma has to do with Europe. And particularly with how a less stable Europe is complicating the broader strategic rebalancing that the administration has been trying to carry out. So I think it's important to understand that a key implicit premise of the Asia pivot was that Europe was basically stable and peaceful, and that it could thus be treated as a relative economy of force in the U.S. in the years to come. And that idea was premised on the notion that relations between Moscow and Washington would remain decently calm and productive. Now, I think both of these judgments are becoming pretty hard to sustain. We don't know how things will shake out in Ukraine in the coming months and years. But there's certainly an increased sense of insecurity hanging over not just that country, but much of Eastern Europe as well. U.S.-Russian relations have become more confrontational and explicitly competitive than at any time since the end of the Cold War. This doesn't mean we're going back to a new Cold War or to Cold War levels of military commitment to Europe. We're not going to have 400,000 troops in Europe anytime soon. But it is already forcing us to reconsider what level and form of commitment are necessary to maintain the climate of reassurance and stability that we've gotten used to having in Europe. It's possible that we can just sort of expand the size of the overall defense spending pie by using some time-tested Pentagon budget tricks to fund the President's European Reassurance Initiative, this new Rapid Reaction Force, and other things that might be useful. But if that's not the case, or if it's only partially the case, then I think we're looking at some even more difficult trade-offs across regions and priorities, at a time when resources are already stretched. A fourth dilemma, and now I'm getting to the Middle East, is that pivoting away from the Middle East has proved a lot harder than it initially looked. And it's become clear that it matters how we pivot from one theater to another. So there's no question that U.S. involvement in Iraq and Afghanistan over the past 10 to 12 years hasn't been as productive as we would have liked. And there's no question that reducing that involvement has been and is important to refocusing on the Asia-Pacific over the long term. But I think it's also true that a pivot that consolidates existing gains is probably stronger than one that perhaps jeopardizes them by refocusing too quickly. And so a key strategic dilemma for the Obama administration has been, and continues to be, that we need to gradually reduce our military exposure in the Middle East, but not in ways that increase insecurity or undercut progress made today. This was never going to be an easy balance to strike. And there was always a limit to what the Obama administration could do, just because the current instability in the Middle East is rooted in so many deep factors over which the United States has relatively little control. But I think that recent events have indicated, and I think a number of Obama administration officials might actually admit, that the Obama administration hasn't struck this balance as well as it might have. If you look back, particularly at the Iraq drawdown in 2011, and the recent events in that country, I think it's hard to make the case that this administration has really made or even really tried hard enough to make incremental investments that might, and I emphasize might, have helped protect what stability was gained in the preceding 3 or 4 years. And in fact, I would say that our recent re-involvement in Iraq over the past month or so constitutes sort of an implicit recognition that we may have been too eager to disengage too quickly in the first place. And I think this overall dynamic is a real tension in our strategy, because I think we've seen that it's possible to leave the Middle East in ways that don't necessarily encourage stability. And that if we do it in ways that encourage instability, it may well come back to bite us. It may actually undermine our ability to be effective in the longer-term rebalancing that we might do. Okay, all of these things tie into a fifth and final dilemma, which is that I think it's important to keep in mind that underreach can ultimately be as dangerous as overreach. Grand strategy is about calibrating the use of power. It's about using it energetically enough to be effective, but not so hyperactively as to be draining or counterproductive. But striking that balance is always the hard part, and it's surely the case now. So I don't doubt for a second that strategic prudence is very valuable, and it's absolutely understandable why the Obama administration would want to err on the side of discretion over the past few years after the experiences of the decade before that. But there is a danger in pulling back too far, too quickly. There's a danger that you can liquidate existing commitments too quickly. There's a danger that too much retrenchment can undermine the stability of the post-Cold War order that's been very good to us. And frankly, I think that one of the things we've seen in the past 3 years, and one of the things that President Obama's speech highlighted last night, is that there is a danger that the consequences of non-intervention or insufficient intervention in a place like Syria can be pretty bad themselves. They can even be as bad as the consequences of intervention. Now, I'll fully admit that I don't precisely know where the point is, where the dangers of underreach exceed the dangers of overreach, and that's in Syria or elsewhere. And really, I think it's hard for anyone to say with any precision where that point is, because doing so involves a combination of really tricky counterfactual analysis and then predicting the future. But I'm pretty sure that this crossover point does exist, and I think the Obama administration is also becoming increasingly conscious that it exists, and that it may be coming up more quickly than they had earlier thought. And then more broadly, I'll just sum up by saying that while I don't think there are many easy solutions to most of the problems or dilemmas that I've outlined here, I'm pretty certain that these are issues that we're going to be grappling with in the years to come. So I know I'm pretty much out of time, so I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hal. Very Posen.
I like to have lots of moments, failing memory. I want to thank John and Jim for inviting me. We should acknowledge the day, and we're here for a reason. It's important and tragic event in the United States, but many other important and tragic events. And I'm here for more prosaic reasons. I'm flooding a book. Amazon.com. It's cheap, a hardback book, $22. I'm a recovering political scientist, so I actually tried to write the book in English, and on some pages I succeeded, so it's not that painful. I'm not going to go over the whole book, obviously very difficult, and maybe some of the areas where Hal and I might disagree, and there are subtle areas we can explore later. Just to explain what the book does, the book basically talks about the evolution of post-Cold War U.S. grand strategy. It launches a critique against that grand strategy, which I think has a great deal of commonality, actually starting with the Clinton administration up to the present. I outline sort of the political dimensions of an alternative, and then I outline a military strategy and a force structure and budget that will be adequate to pursue the political aspects of the alternative. So it has those four parts, and if I tried to talk about all those four, we would be in trouble. So I'm really going to talk about one. I'm going to talk about the fun part, which is why I think this strategy hasn't worked out so well. And there'll be some commonality again with what Hal said, but if as you're thinking about the problems that I lay out, you reflect on Ukraine or you reflect on Iraq and ISIS, I think you'll see that some of the problems that I deduce as having emerged, these problems will continue to exist. These problems will plague what it is we're trying to do in Iraq. We're going to run into those problems again. And we may well be sitting here 10 years hence. My version of U.S. grand strategy is not so different from Hal's. I think pretty early we reached a consensus on what I've been calling liberal hegemony. And it's liberal because we're trying to spread democracy and markets and institutions and all this good stuff. And we're also trying to preserve and even improve upon this very unusually dominant power position the United States walked into when the Cold War ended, when the Soviet Union collapsed. Unusually strong relative to anybody else in the world. Very unusual moment in history. Right? And it didn't take long for us to first notice that we were this powerful, and then second to fetishize the moment, the unipolar moment. So it wasn't about a comfort. It was not about maintaining. The strategy isn't about maintaining a comfortable surplus of power to do what we need to do. It's about maintaining a very dominant global power position along as many dimensions as we can in order to pursue these various liberal principles. The United States was probably as secure as any country, any great power has ever been when the Cold War ended. And yet, Bob Work, who's now the Deputy Secretary of Defense, has a nice briefing chart where he basically shows American months at war, at kinetic war in the post-Cold War world versus American months at war during the Cold War. We're at war about twice as often in the post-Cold War world. We should be asking some questions about this. Right? This is odd for a country that's as secure as we are. Now, one of the things that I like to remember, or that were principles that I would advance, is that a really big national security project abroad is not necessary for American national security. The United States is inherently an incredibly secure country. We're very rich, and even projections, which I'll talk about later, which talk about the direction of things, which will change relative to power in the world, still put the United States in the top 2 or 3 powers in the world, way down the road, way down to the middle of this century. Second, there's still oceans on each side of this country, and they're big. Third, we have relatively weak and pliant neighbors to the north and south. Fourth, we have nuclear weapons. Now, nuclear weapons are funny things. They scare all of us, as they rightly should. But countries that have nuclear weapons are probably not going to be conquered by anybody. Very hard to conquer. Very hard to coerce a country that has nuclear weapons. The United States has a fantastic military. We've been investing in it since 1940, and the investment has paid off. It's a fantastic military. Very capable. We have a tremendous military industrial base. We build really great weapons sooner or later at costs that are off the charts, but sooner or later we'll get a pretty good weapon at a cost that's off the charts. Finally, much of our trade is in this hemisphere. Almost a third of our trade is in this hemisphere. Most of the rest of it is scattered across countries across the world. It's very hard for one big thing to change in the world to so affect American trade, to so affect the American economy, to so affect American power, the United States would be in big trouble. By the way, one of our biggest trading partners is our erstwhile adversary, the Chinese. So there's a dilemma here, right? So if we're worried about losing trade with the country that we're actually in a competition with, there's something odd about that concern, right? So I think the strategy has been unnecessary, it's been counterproductive, it's been costly, and I think it's been wasteful. And the military, political, and economic costs of the strategy are going to go up. They're not going to go down, they're going to go up. Now, why do I think these things are true? Well, like many political scientists, I believe certain theories. Right? And the theory for us is not just somebody's idea. It's some set of ideas about how the political world works that people have tried to test, they've played with. right? Some people try to test them formally, some informally. And by the way, we never really agree that a theory is truly tested, so you can say, I don't like your theories, Barry, I prefer some others, it's fine. Pick your own theories. I think these theories tell us quite a lot of good reasons for this. And we have seen in our actions in the world some of the characteristic ways that other states look out for themselves. So one thing that happens, if one state is particularly energetic, which we have been, other states with some economic base are going to try and balance against you one way or the other. And be better than it was in those years when the Cold War ended, when basically they had nothing. They were not in a position to do much better. And they worked to make this true. They worked at it. China is building military capability, and Al talked about it earlier. Right? Now, we shouldn't exaggerate that yet. They're more capable than they were. They have a long way to go, right? But they also have some advantages, because we want to